Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Roberto Simon. I'm a Senior Director of Policy at American Society Council of the Americas and the head of our anti-corruption working group. I'm really delighted to be here today for this all-star panel on the state of anti-corruption in Brazil, really based on the findings of the Ccc Index, the Capacity to Combat Corruption Index that we launched earlier this month. If you didn't have a chance to check the index, you can find it. We find the full report on our website. We're having a series of events related to the Ccc Index. First, we had the launch. Last week, we had an event on Mexico. Now we're having an event on Brazil. And finally, next week, we'll have an event Tuesday, 10 a.m. on Peru. All these events are being webcasted and recorded. In case you want to watch them afterwards, you can find them on YouTube and on our website. Just before I present the panel, a few important reminders. This is an on-the-record panel, and we're webcasting it through our social media channels and our website. For those of you joining us via WebEx, please make sure your mics are on mute throughout the presentation. For the panelists, I ask you to unmute your mic when you're speaking and then mute again. We'll have Q&A at the end. If you're joining via WebEx, you can use your chat box to send your questions. For those of you following us through social media, you can tag us, ASCOA or America's Quarterly, or you can use the hashtag CCC Index. This event is being sponsored by Control Risks, who's the co-developer of the Ccc Index. We're also very grateful to the general support of CFA Institute, Millicom, Cleary, and Gottlieb. What I think is really interesting about the group of panelists we have today is that, they have very different backgrounds, right? We have a federal prosecutor, an expert in compliance, and an investigative journalist to discuss the Ccc Index findings for Brazil. So Marcelo Ribeiro de Oliveira is a Brazilian federal prosecutor who worked in the Attorney General's office, who advised the OECD on AML, anti-money laundering issues, and is currently part of the Lava Jato task force based in Curitiba. He's also working in Brasilia. Geert Aalbers is a partner at Control Risks and the head of the company's Brazil and Southern Cone business. He's also, our partner in crime for the Ccc Index, and the co-author of our report. Last but certainly not least, Alana Rizzo is currently an advisor at Albright Stonebridge Group, based in São Paulo. Before that, Alana spent over a decade working as an investigative journalist in several leading publications in Brazil, and she was also a director at Brazil's Investigative Journalism Association, ABRAGE, working with access of information, among other very important topics. Just before we get started, I'm going to make a very short presentation showing everyone the findings of the Ccc Index. I promise it's really 4 or 5 slides. Let me start from the beginning, just to get the conversation started. So this is Brazil's place in the overall ranking. Right? It's the 4th place behind countries like Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica, but ahead of Peru, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, and others. Remember that the score is out of 10, right? So Brazil is 5.52 out of 10. What is alarming in Brazil's case is when we look at the scores that we had in 2019, Brazil was one of the worst cases of, I would say, deterioration of the anti-corruption environment. With a 10% drop. We had some significant drops also for countries like Guatemala and Venezuela, but Brazil, among the big economies in the region, is kind of the only country that had such a pronounced drop. We're going to discuss the causes for this drop during this panel. But the index is composed of 3 subcategories, right? Legal capacity, which relates to, from the independence of courts, the strength of anti-corruption agencies, all the way to the quality of plea legislation, and democracy and political institution, which is the green bar that you're seeing in our screen, which relates to the overall quality of democracy, lobbying legislations or how you pay for electoral campaigns and so on, and civil society, media, and the private sector, ranging from the quality of investigative journalism, the strength of NGOs, and so on. What is interesting here is if you look at Brazil's legal capacity, the purple bar, you see that Brazil is actually fairly close to countries like Chile. And this was, by the way, the area where we saw the most significant drop since 2019. Or last year's result, Brazil was actually ahead of Chile in the legal capacity subcategory. But when you look at democracy and political institution, Brazil is at the levels, or it's behind countries like Argentina and Colombia, the green bar, right? And civil society, we see Brazil almost at the same level of countries like Argentina, Mexico, Costa Rica. This is the 14 categories that we look at, divided in the three areas that I mentioned: legal capacity, democracy and political institutions, civil society, media, and the private sector. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to highlight a few interesting things. When you look at the second bar here, anti-corruption agencies, independence, and efficiency, we see that Brazil is actually significantly above the regional average, which is kind of this white line. But when you look at other areas like the overall enforceability of campaign finance, Brazil is significantly behind the regional average, right? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. And I think my first question to all the panelists is, what is your reaction to the findings? I know you guys took a look at the report. I'm going to go here around the room asking, let me start with Geert, who's the co-author, and Geert and I had the opportunity to present the index, but in the presentation we didn't discuss, at length the Brazilian case. So Geert, what do you think is really remarkable about Brazil here? What is your analysis on Brazil, also from a perspective of a person working a lot with compliance and private companies? And let me also thank every one of the panelists for joining us today.
So hello, everyone, and I'm really thrilled to be here with Marcelo and Alana. It would be really awkward if I said different things that you've just stated about Brazil, since we co-wrote the report. But I just perhaps like to rephrase and recontextualize some of those comments. So we had the benefit this year. We looked at 15 countries. Last year we looked at 8. And by looking at 15, we're actually able to subdivide the countries across a region. So we had a clear category of countries which systematically perform above the regional average on all the variables. And that's Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica, all the way, which is group 1, all the way down to group 4 in Venezuela, which systematically underperform. I think one of the things we need and have teased out is that Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, and Peru in group 2, and Mexico then in group 3, that is really the bulk of the region in terms of economies and the like. What happens in these countries will determine whether the region as a whole on the anti-enforcement front moves more towards OECD style levels like group 1, or towards Venezuela and at the bottom of the rank. So I think that's a space to watch. That means that when we say this year, and that's one of the themes I think we teased out, is that there is a certain level of stagnation or regression across the region. That's a concerning trend. We saw that most notably with Brazil, for example, although Brazil still performs very well. I think that's extremely important to highlight. We saw it with Venezuela, we saw it with Guatemala. Obviously, they were the biggest drops. But when we look at each of these categories, which you highlighted, legal capacity, democracy and political institutions, and civil society, media, and the private sector, only one country in each one of these categories actually improved the score from last year. So in the case of legal capacity, it was Peru. In the case of the democracy and political institutions, it was Argentina, mainly on the back of a new campaign financing law. And in the case of civil society, it was Colombia, although they started from a relatively low basis. And the last comment I just want to make to introduce and then pass on to the panelists is that it's really, really clear how important legal capacity is for the capacity to combat corruption. So when we look at all of the leaders in the ranking, they are the ones who have strong rule of law, legal capacity, even if some of the democratic credentials are not as strong. For example, Brazil and Peru, as you correctly highlighted. When we look at the other side of the spectrum, so at the bottom end of the scoring, we see how important civil society, relatively important civil society, and investigative journalism and the like are to further the battle against corruption, especially where democracy is failing and where legal capacity is pretty much weakened. So I'll leave it at that for Marcelo and Alana to complement, and then we can get into what this means for companies and the like.
Sure, Marcelo. One of the areas that was a concern for us was the independence of enforcement agencies that we saw a drop. Also, some judicial decisions impacting white-collar crime legislation. I wanted to hear your overall view, and if you can comment a little bit on those particular areas that you're deeply involved with. What does the CCC Index tells you? And thank you again for being with us today.
Roberto, it's a pleasure to join this high-level conversation about a so sensitive theme. Just a brief disclaimer: it's my own personal view of those issues. It not represents any official federal prosecutor statement. Some issues regarding our independence. We noticed that in an external level, in a rule of law, we had some decreases regarding the anti-abuse of authority rule or anti-abuse of authority bill that was sanctioned by the president. His statement is that this law would interrupt some misuses of our powers, but in fact it creates more difficult to prosecute the crimes. For example, in the kind of collaboration agreements, we lost many possibilities to develop those settlements. And I made this disclaimer because even my opinions can be considered abuse of authority. So we had this decrease. It's very sensitive for us. And in the internal level, everybody who follows Brazil know that we don't have a rule in the Federal Prosecution Service that demands that the president follows a list that the prosecutors make to choose the general prosecutor. But we have a tradition for more than 10 years, and it was followed, and it wasn't followed that time. So we had a decrease of legitimacy. Internally, we don't consider we were not considered as a player for the president. So it creates some discomfort for many of us. And regarding the rulings, we had a ruling in July last year regarding the FIU, regarding COA, that was reversed in the end of the year. And I think that the reversal was very important to keep the independence of COA. And it was only possible due to the presence of the OECD high-level mission started from the work group and some pressure from the civil society. I think it was a very important move. And if we lose, in fact we did, if we lost independence, if this rule was not reversed, we would be in a way worse position.
I want to go back to you afterwards to discuss more anti-money laundering, which I think it's a critical area for Brazil. But before we do that, Alana, again, thank you for joining us. What is your reaction to the index from the perspective of an investigative journalist with such an interesting experience?
Thank you. a pleasure to be here. And all the topics that my colleagues just mentioned, they all got my attention, especially because it puts us in risk. And from my perspective, the index highlights something that I think we should pay attention. That is how civic space is shrinking in Brazil. Not only the space for independent media and for journalists because of the attacks that we've been seeing, not only in Brazil. I think what we see right now in Brazil, there's a lot of similarities with what we see in the US, but it's super important for us to understand that all the anti-corruption movement that we saw in the past in Brazil, it was based not only in the legal institutions like Marcelo and Geert just mentioned, but also in the independent media that was covering, for example, the car wash operation that was covering Congress and all the advance that we've been seeing. So it's really important that we understand that this shrinking has a huge impact at least from my perspective, when we think about the results of the index. And we have to think how we can help build a more safe environment for reporters, but also for civil society. I think those 2 points is super important when we think how we want to move forward and go back, or at least not go back, or at least move forward on the anti-corruption efforts that we're looking for our country.
Great. So let me continue on this that you just mentioned with you, Alana. So what exactly changed since Bolsonaro came to power in terms of investigative journalists, people on the ground in Brasilia covering anti-corruption? If you had to highlight like 3 major changes, what is new now? What is this new environment in Brazil looks like?
Yeah, perfect. That's a really good question. Because I think what we can see right now is how Bolsonaro's administration has been taking extreme measures to weaken journalism. So, and that brings a lot of attacks. We've been seeing a lot of attacks against journalists, not only from the support base of government Bolsonaro, but also from the government, reducing the space, for example, for journalists to cover what's going on. And we know how important it is for journalists to cover what's going on in the government. But also that brings another point of attention is the self-censorship. Because of the amount of attacks, that develops, that can bring journalists to not only go after a story because they think that's going to drive a lot of attacks. And of course, no one wants to deal with the attacks they're dealing with social media, but also physical attacks. We've been seeing physical attacks to journalists. That's something that we have to think about it, how we can deal with this, and how not only news outlet, but the civil society can work to strain journalism. And one thing that I would like to mention is what we've been seeing right now during the pandemic, because of course, during the pandemic, the attacks online, they increased, but also what we've been seeing is the reduce of transparency of the government, and that also affects the way journalism works. Something happened, I don't know how familiar everyone is what's going on in Brazil, but a couple of weeks ago, something that I've never seen as a reporter, news organizations, they got together as a coalition to go after data from COVID-19 here in Brazil, because the Minister of Health decided not to deliver and not to publicize the information they were releasing. And so they changed the time they're releasing, and also the amount of data and the data they were releasing. So journalists got together and they're doing as a coalition, as a consortium, all competitors, working together to bring to Brazilian society the data from COVID-19 to understand the broader aspect of what we're living right now. So I think at the same time that we have, back to your point, extreme measures from the government to attack journalists, what I see is journalists, building resilience, and that it's super important for journalism and civic space in Brazil.
Marcelo, based on some of the things that Alana mentioned, I want to ask you about Lava Jato. You're a member of the Lava Jato task force. Lava Jato has been a huge story for the Brazilian media, and a story that's been going on for more than 5 years, right? What is the future of Lava Jato in your view, in terms of investigation? Is it going to end at some point, or because we're seeing ramifications, right? Very different Lava Jatos actually in places like Rio, Curitiba, Brasilia. Can you give us kind of a summary of what's going on and your views on Lava Jato in 2020?
Roberto, I think if I knew that what's going to happen with Lava Jato, it would be a $1 million question. In fact, if Lava Jato had to end today, with no further investigation steps, only processing the information we already have, we would have at least more 2 years of new cases. Without making any other searches, any other telephonic interception, telematic interception, we would have at least 2 more years. We have so many materials, to work with. But task force, in its definition, it's something temporary. We could not last forever. And I think we can think in a short view, the end of the case. And that perspective that you mentioned, that we have some Lava Jatos in other states, it's a symptom of what I'm saying. In fact, we are trying to reproduce the way we worked here in Curitiba to other states, and to share when it's possible, be together. In fact, we have many cases to work with, and I can precise when it's going to end and how it's going to end. In fact, the most important thing for us is to keep the legacy and regarding the investigative tools, the coordination with other key partners like CGU, like the federal police. I think Lava Jato create an environment that we can work closer than we did before. And I don't know when Lava Jato went, but our procedure keeps. I think it works.
Let me bring you to the conversation here, and basically you've been working in Brazil for a long time in compliance and investigations, and Lava Jato has been transformative to the business sector as well, right? So what is your view, also based on the things that we've seen in the index, and the fact that Brazil is in a better position in several aspects than other countries, but moving forward, how do you see the evolution of compliance and investigations with this new phase of, I won't use the word post-Lava Jato based on what Marcelo just said, but a new Lava Jato and more fragmented Lava Jato?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting when we look at the report we wrote last year, and even we as authors forget what we write. It's interesting to go back and take a look. And we highlighted, as a matter of fact, 4 things to look out for from Brazil, right? The things to watch, and we have that in this year's report as well. And the 4 things we looked at were, as Marcelo mentioned, the possibility that there will be a general prosecutor nominated outside the shortlist. We looked at the Supreme Court decision around whether defendants sentenced in appeal can continue to seek legal remedies outside of prison. We looked at the anti-corruption package, which was sent through, which is going to be sent through Congress, and we also looked at what Alana mentioned, transparency challenges. And I think the first thing that needs to be mentioned is that on all 4 fronts there have been negative developments, which is quite concerning, and that I think is overall captured in Brazil's drop. On the other hand, I think it's important to state as well that the legacy of Lava Jato and other investigations, but certainly what we've seen here in Brazil, when we compare Brazil to other countries, Brazil is still far ahead in terms of its capacity to combat corruption in many respects, whether, as Marcel mentioned, the use of collaboration agreements, although they have obviously been affected by this most recent law that's been implemented, the level and quality of international enforcement. I think Brazil exceeds there, and certainly Peru is another country where we're seeing quite a lot of cooperation with Brazil, but also outside Latin America. So, in the case of Brazil, I know Switzerland and the United States, very important ties have been forged there on the enforcement front. And when we look, on the other hand, at the corporate environment, we have seen that companies have responded. Unfortunately, in most cases, companies respond. Obviously, one thing is to have deeply ingrained values of ethics and transparency as part of corporate values. That's a good thing. That's a minimum requirement. The other thing is noticing that your environment is changing, that there is actually an end to impunity, which is one of the big issues that we've faced across Latin America and certainly in Brazil. And then the balance and the calculus for companies starts changing. So companies in earnest, as of around 2014, 2015, started implementing compliance programs. So the expertise and the maturity of those programs now, I would also say, is quite far ahead, certainly compared to the rest of Latin America. It's very much in development. The concern, of course, is if there is a slowdown in enforcement, either because of the capacity or the lack of political will to enforce, whichever one happens, and they're obviously interrelated, over time, there may be some level of erosion of companies looking to invest in bolstering compliance. So conducting their own internal investigations, making sure that they're dealing with reputable third parties, making sure that they have proper training so that their individuals or their team members know what to be out on the lookout for, knowing what to ask of suppliers and other vendors, making it very clear what kind of behavior they expect if they want to do business with the companies. But there's been a very significant progress on that front in the private sphere, and the jury's out now to see whether that will continue if we do indeed see some form of diminishing capacity in Brazil on a sustained level. We've only touched on and we only highlighted the possibility that that's starting to happen. Obviously, next year's index, I think, will be telling.
So also an area that deeply affects the private sector, and I want to hear Marcelo's opinion. You mentioned COAF, the Brazilian intelligence unit for financial crimes. Of course, we saw since the beginning of the Bolsonaro administration a lot of a political dispute around COAF. First, the idea to put the agency under the Ministry of Justice, then Congress vetoed that, and then there were discussions about reforming the board of COAF. And at the end, we now have a settlement. They wanted to change the name of COAF for Financial Intelligence Unit. Now we have the COAF under the central bank, with some changes to its board and some question marks regarding, what will happen next. And COAF has been really described as a success case in Brazil's fight against corruption, Marcelo. And I know you work a lot with financial intelligence, and all the major anti-corruption investigation in Brazil started with financial intelligence, right? Are you optimistic about what's going on with COAF? How do you think the AML space will change with this new COAF?
Roberto, despite of all those discussions that we had last year, the ongoing work from COAF is still very good for us. In fact, FIUs in general and COAF in particular are one of the best sources we have to get red flags regarding some corruption schemes. And I'm very confident that it will work. It will work this year. We have some outputs from COAF so far, and I think things are working. I'm very optimistic that the issues we had last year, in the end of the day, gave more strength to COAF. And for me, the perspective that COAF must have from to the future is to get more closer to the other FIUs, to get, when it's possible, of course, to give more transparency of its work, to make the civil society perceive the importance that the COAF has. And one challenge, of course, I think it does not fit to work at this moment in our conversation, but to deal with one future issue that all FIUs will have to deal with is that how FIUs will work with the cryptocurrency issue. In fact, it's not a currency, so at first we don't work with the bank system. It's a real issue, and it's a key player that you.
Can I just quickly ask a follow-up question there, Roberto, regarding the information exchange? So interesting your comment, Marcelo, I think about COAF and it's moving it from Minister of Justice to under the central bank. And there were a lot of concerns flagged at the time. So it's encouraging to hear that that hasn't really had a negative impact on investigations. How about the relationship with the tax authorities? Because there are also, and the information exchange with tax authorities, because there are also some issues in the past and potential interference, which made alarm bells ring. So I'd be interested to hear how that's moving.
First, let's talk about the ruling of the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court decided the question regarding COAF, they also made a very important comment that the tax authority could share those. That movement was very important, and the tax authority it's another very important player we have when we make the analysis of the evolution of the assets that some people that are under investigation. It's very important to have that support from the tax authority. And of course, we are working in a very cautious way. Maybe the ruling from the Supreme Court could allow us to go in a more aggressive way. But since in Brazil we have no such stability in the rulings, we work in a more conservative way. And always we request to the judge to get an order to make this first contact with the tax authority. So they are very important, but very cautious in order to get this contact with them.
We're gonna open to Q&A very shortly. So I see we already have a few questions. For those who are on WebEx, you can send your questions to the Q&A moderator using the chat box on the right side of your screen. For those of you following us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, you can use the hashtag Ccc Index or tag us directly. Let's discuss a little bit what changes with COVID-19, right? And I think we're seeing a huge shock to the anti-corruption space in Brazil and everywhere in the region. And Alana, one of the areas that we're seeing is kind of the deterioration of Brazil's economic situation, with huge implications for the media sector, right? We're seeing basically all the big Brazilian newspapers in dire straits firing reporters, especially more experienced reporters. Are you afraid that investigative journalism will fall victim to the economic crisis, or do you think other media outlets can kind of fill the space? What is your take on that specifically?
Thank you. Just one quick comment on what my colleagues just mentioned. I'm really happy to see they're optimistic, the message that they're sending to us, and it's good to see Marcelo, for example, giving us an optimistic, because especially I think from our side, from the journalist side, we've been seeing so many attacks, and there's just such a huge disinformation campaigns and information disorder like we've been seeing. So sometimes we have the sense that it's all bad, and it's really good to see colleagues mention, it's not all bad. There's like positive things right now, and they're working together with authority, the COAFI and tax authority. So it's good to have this positive side of the situation we're living right now. Going back to your question about the pandemic and the economic crisis that we've been seeing and how this affects journalism, of course, huge impact on journalism. But I think at the same time that it's a huge impact on journalists and news outlet, like we mentioned, there is a need for information, and that in the other hand, just trying to bring the bright side of the situation. If there is a bright side, of course, in this whole crisis, there is no bright side. But the confidence of the society in the media went up, especially in the legacy media. That is really important for journalists. We've been seeing the confidence going down. People were, moving forward to influencers, to social media. They were getting information there, and they saw during the pandemic how important it is to have quality information. So I think that's the good part when we think about the journalism crisis. But Brazil has a bigger problem, not only in the big news outlet, but we have, so I was getting a couple of numbers just to share with you guys. But for example, Brazil has 62% of municipalities are news desert. There's no media outlet in those places. And 18% of the Brazilian population has no access to local news. And we know, especially when we think about anti-corruption efforts, how important it is to have local media investigating your mayor, investigating what's happening in your city, in your state, in the state level. So we have a big problem, and of course, with the economic crisis, that's gonna be even worse because of the main news outlet. They're firing. There's a lot of layoffs, but we have the social media, and I think technology, especially right now, like we've been living all through the computers and all during the pandemic, I think this can be a potential revolution for journalism. And thinking about the investigative journalism, I think we're gonna be, we have new tools right now to investigate using social media and to engage more people. I think that's something that's important when we think about journalism and how people are looking after good information and quality information. I think we're showing how important it is, and technology can be a super important tool to bring the society to invest in journalists, to see the value of journalism. Trying to bring the bright, not only the negative sides of all this information disorder we're seeing.
And Geert, I know you've been spending a lot of time thinking about COVID-19 and how it impacts the private sector. What is your take on Brazil specifically? Is there something unique to Brazil, or is it just, like everywhere, companies are operating under duress and trying to, be mindful and have strong compliance system? What is your take?
Well, let me first compliment Alana on her for sharing our general spirit of optimism. I think it's a good thing in the current world we live in. So there's always a positive side to things, and it's not all bad news. The COVID-19 situation, obviously, and it's a global phenomenon in terms of its impact on fraud and corruption. We're seeing it play out very strongly in the region as well, where there are increased risks of fraud and corruption. Unfortunately, we've seen many situations out here in Brazil. Governors under investigation, obviously the state of Pará is one of them. Rio is another one where there are impeachment actions currently against the governor there. But it's not just Brazil, right? We've seen in Colombia, half the governors almost are under investigation, and the agricultural minister. In Bolivia, we've seen that the health minister has been imprisoned. And that's really because we have a huge amount of resources which have been dedicated to government spending for the acquisition of ventilators, oxygen, and PPE equipment, and the fact that a lot of intermediaries have been used, and third parties are obviously a very high risk category generally, with shortened or flexibilized kind of procurement procedures, and that generally means less transparent and less competitive bids. That is not something which is going to go away, and we do think that that's that will obviously be a focus. I expect of the prosecutors across the region, including here in Brazil. I do think that Brazilian companies, as I mentioned, because there's a certain level of maturity of compliance within Brazil, more so, for example, than in most of its neighbors. I would almost say all, but I don't want to be rude to every country in Latin America, so let's leave it at most. I think many companies are better positioned here in Brazil to detect potential wrongdoing or to prevent it, preferably. But it is very, very clear that the extent of the damage created is pretty high. And on top of that, getting back to the economic effects, which impact journalism, they also impact both government and they impact companies. So if we think about the economic hangover from the pandemic, we might see less resources, that need to be divided among many other priorities, to get the economy back on track. The fiscal deficit is obviously creeping up in many countries, and Brazil is no exception. And for companies, they are under a lot of financial pressure. And, one of the areas they may decide to cut, not necessarily a very smart decision, but the one area that they may decide to cut is curtail some of their investments on the compliance front. And therefore, we just need to see how that plays out. But it doesn't come at a very good moment, given that the overall trend we've seen is slightly on the downward slope.
Roberto, can I make a really quick question? One of the things that I've been thinking was a lot about when thinking about the private sector and thinking about journalism is this idea of what were you doing during the pandemic? What kind of value were you put in the society? What kind of actions were you doing? Do you think that also has an impact? Thinking on creative ways for companies, not only to get out of their economic crisis, but also helping society?
I think that's a great point, and it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So I think it would be wrong, and I think that's a little bit of the message which is starting to burble up. Demonizing companies because they've been, basically profiting in some respects from bringing equipment to Brazil and things like that. But it is an absolutely necessary part of the solution. So let's be very clear that companies have the right to do that, and they should, and they're part of the overall value chain in its broadest sense. We have seen really encouraging signs of companies stepping up the plate in terms of their willingness to contribute, to donate, and the like. And when I say there are multiple examples of that. But when I say it's a double-edged sword, is because we've also seen, for example, the very same donations used in a very untoward manner to try and influence government. And that's the fine balance which needs to be struck, right? So one thing is to make sure, one thing is to have a noble program and objective in place. The other one is how it's executed. And that's where the controls and checks need to be in place. But you're absolutely right to signal that companies have been, many companies have done remarkable things to contribute to the solution of COVID-19.
Marcelo, any views on how COVID-19 is impacting the work of prosecutors in Brazil? And besides, you were telling us about audiences through Zoom and how this changes your day-to-day operation. But in terms of corruption opportunities, as Geert was highlighting, we're already seeing several cases in Brazil involving governors, involving fake companies who, are now procuring or allegedly have big contracts with governments. What is your view on this situation?
Roberto, just following up what Geert commented, I think we had some change of mentality of the corporative sector since 2014. Companies try to detach from dirty politicians and public agents. And I think that the great test of this change of mentality is COVID-19. We will have more loose public procurement procedures. We'll have more opportunities to have corruption acts. So that will be the final or the most decisive test. And some companies are not complying with that. We can tell that when we see so many investigations that are being executed, and some governance and some issues in the municipality level. One point that Alana mentioned that is very important: the absence of transparency in some cities that doesn't have any kind of press. Brazil has three levels of government, and we can see very clearly that there's a huge difference between what happens in the federal level. We have some criticisms regarding the federal level, but it's more transparent when we compare to many other cities. So it's a great issue, and when you consider that COVID-19 will affect all those three levels,
we're receiving a few questions, and Marcelo, I have two questions for you, and I'm gonna put them. There are some of them I don't think you love them, but no, I'm kidding. So the first question is about international collaboration and asset seizure specifically. We've known, car wash was largely based on the exchange of information between Brazil and the United States, Switzerland, but also for asset seizure. Can you comment on kind of the future of or the trajectory that you're seeing, or the trends in collaboration in Brazil? The second question, which I think it's inevitable, and it's your view on Sergio Moro's entry into politics and the legacy of Lava Jato for prosecutors, and the charges that at the end Lava Jato was really an anti-PT campaign, and you have people like, and the person mentions Aécio Neves specifically. We've seen this is kind of a clash, a political clash that we see all the time in Brazil. I think it would be interesting to hear from you. How do you react to that?
I think Roberto is disguising one of his questions in the questions he's asking you, Marcelo.
Wherein the moderator can confirm that someone here from the WebEx session that asked you that.
Close that questions, I see. Let's start from the easiest one, but the most important in my perspective, that regarding the international cooperation. I think that we developed a point of no return on that. We're much more closer than our counterparts, even in the United States, even in the UK, in Switzerland. We made an internal study, and we have more than 15 countries that we're very close, exchanging through the formal channels and exchanging knowledge and how to work through the informal channels. It's something very interesting that there are a lot of criticisms regarding Lava Jato, because you talk to someone to make a call is not any kind of malpractice to exchange emails or to exchange some impressions regarding a case when you make a call. But when you're about to share evidence, to share something that you have to use formally, we always follow the formal channels. So, and I think we developed a good practice on it. We are sharing in other states, and I think it's all going to increase. I think, as I mentioned, it's a point of no return. Regarding Sergio Moro, I started in Lava Jato after he left the office, but I have the legacy, and I have a very peculiar thinking about it. I think it wasn't a good move. I think he should keep being a judge. And that move, in my personal view, it wasn't good. And everything that went before after that was a very, very, very bad thing. The first move to left the office was the worst of all, in my perspective. And regarding some aspect regarding if Lava Jato was against any or another party. You just have to look at what we have done in the last 2 years, 2019 and 2020. We have no party. Of course, if the executive branch of power was led by one party, it's natural that that party was more affected in the investigation. But everyone that we met conducting some crime, we were trying to reach out. So I don't take it in consideration that we had some partiality on it.
That was a tough question. Okay, so let me, but a very good answer. Let me ask. There's one question to Alana on fake news and or the place of fake news and anti-corruption in Brazil. How do you see that from the perspective of an investigative journalist, or the use of anti-corruption to go after people sometimes, with false information? Does it undermine anti-corruption in Brazil and the rule of law? What is your take?
Good. What Marcelo just mentioned about the, I think the movement that Sérgio Moro did, it also helped this political clash and this polarization. And we know that polarization and fake news, disinformation campaigns, they work together. So I think it's interesting how to understand that this phenomenon, you use hate speech, you use fake news, you use polarization to clash, and that's what we've been seeing right now in Brazil. There's the latest report of Reuters Institute of Journalists was released last week, said that 84% of Brazilians, they don't know what to trust, they don't know what's true or what's false, and it's one of the higher numbers in I think 40 countries. So I think that shows the lack of confidence of Brazilians, not only in institutions but also in what they see, and that has a huge impact for anti-corruption efforts or in the institutions that are fighting corruption. And when you think about fake news, I think we have to understand that part of the narrative that Bolsonaro's used during the campaign and what put him in place in government was the anti-corruption agenda. And of course, because of the polarization that we see, there is a lot of fake news using corruption as part of this information disorder. So it is, back to your point, how do I see? I think this agenda helped it just helped polarize Brazil. And when you polarize, we know when you polarize, you're not open to dialogue, you're not open to debate, and that mines not only the confidence of Brazilians and the Brazilian institutions, and that it's bad for the anti-corruption efforts, but also it undermines public policies, because there's no conversation. When there's no conversation, there's no room for debate. Of course, public policy, the quality of the public policy just go down, and that includes anti-corruption policies.
Geert, the question on investors' perspective or perceptions of corruption in Brazil and the legacy of car wash. You work a lot with attorneys in the United States, in Europe, and investors. What did it change? Do you think Bolsonaro is reversing some of the perceptions, or that Brazil was making progress? Or what is your take on that?
So we work with both international investors and local investors. I think there are a couple of common themes there. I think one of the complexities is that in Brazil currently we have a triple crisis, as they like to say, right? The economic crisis, political crisis, and a health crisis. And in a very perverse way, that is slightly drowning out the concerns around corruption. So the main concerns of investors are around those. How does this play out? But obviously, on the corruption front, I think investors were very encouraged, particularly international investors, very encouraged by what they saw in Brazil over the past few years, certainly since 2014. and which subsequently, I think, also spread across the region. I think it's important to state that despite what we have noted in the index with a drop in illegal capacity, that the level of enforcement in Brazil is still higher generally than other parts in Latin America. Again, I'll reinforce the fact that most companies have compliance higher on their agenda than in other parts of Latin America, and that gives a certain level of comfort. However, I think what investors are most concerned about are some of the trends. So there is, Bolsonaro, like AMLO in Mexico, campaigned very heavily on the anti-corruption agenda. Basically owned it when he was put into office. To some extent, I think people thought, okay, that's done. We don't need to fight for that anymore because we now have a president who is very adamant and believes in this cause. And I think we haven't really seen that play out, and that it was more rhetoric than practice. And as a result, combined with the other factors, I think that's what's keeping or getting investors a little nervous. And we will really have to see how this, how the developments occur now in the next 6 months to a year or so.
We only have a few more minutes. I want to go around the room with one question to all of you, which is, do you think when we look at this deterioration that we saw in the CCC Index, do you think this is a temporary turbulence, or are you pessimistic about kind of Brazil's future in the fight against corruption? Do you think we're looking at a long-term downward trajectory, or is it something that can, Brazil can rebound and resume its progress in the fight against corruption? Let me start with Marcelo, but I'll ask also Geert and Alana to answer that.
Roberto, it seems in part unpredictable, but we have some path to analyze that. Is that the question that we are trying to change the constitution in order to confirm the possibility to have the arrest of those one who are convicted before the final judgment. That question that we went through, it was a step back for us, of course. I think not only the change of the rule or the constitution, but how the debate will be developed will indicate to us if you have some real concern and real advances reversing that decrease we had in the evaluation of this year, or it's a downhill. I don't know.
So mostly pessimistic. Alana, what is your take?
No, hopefully, it's not downhill and it's not a trend. I think it of course, it depends a lot on our institutions, and I think recently they've been showing that they're using the checks and balance system. That they're trying to avoid bigger danger, bigger problems for Brazil. So I think it depends a lot on our institutions. We've been seeing in the Supreme Court, Congress, but the problem is they send mixed signals. But I think as thinking about the journalism and civil society, we have to watch really close and participate in the discussions that Brazil is having right now. I think empowering journalism and empowering civic society and of course our institutions, it's mandatory for our democracy, and we have to keep an eyes wide open.
Great. Geert, we'll end with you. We have 2 more minutes.
All right, so I'll keep it very short. I think I share the kind of moderate pessimism or optimism. I'm not quite sure what I detected there. It's very, very clear, 1 year in a trend. If we look back 5 years, we look back at 6 years, 2014 to today, absolutely Brazil is in a better place than it was 6 years ago. And therefore, it's normal that the pendulum swings to and fro, but hopefully it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and not vice versa. What we have seen now is clearly a step back, and whether that step back solidifies will depend very much also on, Alana mentioned, institutional performance, and we've seen evidence of that functioning a little bit better very recently, but also legislative reforms, which which have been put forward, which will help kind of codify some of the practices. And of course, private sector will need to continue to play its part. And we do see more and more commitment by companies globally, not just in Brazil, but obviously the subsidiaries here in Brazil as well, who are absolutely committed to transparent and ethical working environment and business environment. And I think they can also be catalysts for change. I hope, and you and I are very passionate about Ccc Index, and I hope we can speak for you as well. Conversations like this as well with people like Marcelo and Alana and ones we've had in other countries. I really, really hope if there's anything that comes out of this is that it contributes somewhat to consolidating the positive trend that we saw over the past couple of years. So that's my final message here.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. The purpose of the Ccc Index is really to foster a more policy-oriented discussion, trying to find solutions to improving the rule of law in the region, in Brazil and elsewhere. So on that positive note, let me thank all the participants here. Thank you so much for joining us, reminding everyone we have a last session on Peru on Tuesday, 10 a.m. East. So stay tuned. Thank you, and stay safe, stay healthy, and see you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.